Hello, hello. Time for my last big stream of the week. But we're going to do a classic favorite with going over GitHub, or specifically Git. We'll just do it through GitHub because it's nicer. But I know that some folks probably are still dealing with ad breaks, so we're going to give it a little bit of extra time. I've actually been very curious. What's the length of ad break for y'all? Usually it's about a minute or two for me, but if it's longer than that, I just wanted to get a feel for what people are running into so that way I can accommodate that better. Maybe folks are still jumping in. Or maybe you don't have ad breaks. Who knows? Okay. Well, no one's answering me, so presumably it's about a minute, maybe two. But in the meantime, like I said, this is going to be a Git workshop. If you've been to past Global Hack Weeks where I've hosted this, it's pretty much the same, so it's a good review. If you happen to have had experience with some of the commands that we go over, like chime in, let me know. Or if you're like still, still having some issues with it, also let me know. Maybe we can spend more time on it. Again, because I've done this before, my thinking is like, well, if you come with like specific questions, we can actually deep dive on them and try them out. Okay, so sometimes people get no ad breaks, sometimes people get, ad breaks for like a minute or two. Okay, which is about what I expected. Well, excuse me. I've been streaming all week and I can tell. Right. So, as for how we're going to get started, as always, I usually recommend people sign up for GitHub. That said, GitHub just is on top of Git. So all the stuff that we learn with regards to Git commands can be used anywhere else. So while I prefer to use GitHub and most people prefer to use GitHub, there are other places that people like using, such as GitLab, Bitbucket, and plenty others that I'm probably not aware of. And so I would recommend pick the one that best suits your needs. I've used GitLab before because it was more secure for a separate company. Jesus. All right. We're going to end the week with me coughing. Great. But yeah, so I usually use GitHub, but I've been known to use other platforms just because of company needs, etc. So you might look into what the differences are between them to choose the one that's best fit for you. But the majority of us, at least in hackathon stuff, dev post, we tend to expect GitHub just because it's public. You can access repos a lot easier. That's also what a lot of people use already. So if you're sharing things, making things open source, your choice. And then the other thing I would recommend folks use is if you are an active student at a high school, university, community college, I think possibly boot camp, basically anything that you can prove that you have a schedule for your semester, you have a university email or some form of .edu email, you are eligible for the Student Developer Pack. If you don't have a .edu email, but you are attending a school of some sort, then you just have to jump through some extra hoops with that. But the Student Developer Pack is my favorite thing. I'm not just shilling it. It's just because it's something that has a ton of different resources for folks to use, especially if you are into hacking, you want to get to know more technologies, more resources, more libraries. Highly, highly recommend the Student Developer Pack. So before we get into that GitHub presentation, we're actually going to go ahead and walk through what even is the Student Developer Pack and why should you have it? What could you do with it? I do think usually there's going to be some form of challenge about getting the Student Developer Pack, which you can also, if you need to submit things and you don't have access because you're not a student, there's a way to bypass that. So it's not only for students, but it's also for teachers. GitHub Classroom has also gone on and done plenty of amazing things that leverage the Student Developer Pack. But you get access to Copilot for free. You can get some introductory classes and courses. Get familiar with the things that you're using. There's access to certification exams. One thing that I've been looking into is getting a MongoDB certification, which through GitHub Student Developer Pack, I would have access to a free exam. No. So with this workshop, you can choose to follow along if you'd like, but there's not really much to follow along with. I'm picking an arbitrary project that I've done in the last, like yesterday, actually. I did yesterday's project, and I'm going to walk you through different commands you can use and what they mean and what they do, so that if and when you are ready to start using GitHub or Git specifically, and you want to see it in action before just reading a Stack Overflow, reading documentation, or just being like, well, people told me to do this, you can actually see it live and in practice and understand a better idea of what's going on. All right, so Student Developer Pack, again, there's lots of introductories. I actually should go through this intro to open source one. But it teaches you more than just like how to use a tool, but also the vocabulary, which is awesome. These are actually a lot of things. I had so the thing is, these are all unfamiliar to me because the Student Developer Pack is changing all of the time. They're always making like collaboration partnership deals with a variety of different folks and companies who want to make sure that their stuff is accessible for students like you. I'm trying to find one that I do want. Yeah, so here's all of the offers, most popular. The one that I'm thinking of is, yeah, so you could get Microsoft Azure credit. I did that a while back. I have actually access to Notion through my university, but if you don't, you could have access to it. And where's the one that I wanted? Yeah, so this is one of our newer, like the Student Developer Pack's newer like partners. Codex, it will give you, you'll get 6 months of Codex Club, a premium membership for free, which is a new learn to code platform with courses in all sorts of things. I know they've been doing their own like Codex Wrapped right now on Instagram. It's super cute. But they're a really cool company. I got a chance to meet with them, talk with them. And as far as someone who works in education, or at least has done a PhD in education, I thought this was a really, really cool company to put this together. Like, don't get me wrong, I love Khan Academy, but like, I'm very excited to jump into this and see if there's anything else I can learn. But I highly recommend. But everybody's different, and so there's lots of different things you could do, use, etc. Like I use the MongoDB one a lot. Their offer is that you get $50 in MongoDB Atlas credit. And you also get access to the certification, which is like $150. And that's not a bad idea. It's really awesome. You get access to so much. If you are in high school, you get access to Microsoft Azure, and so on and so forth. Like I know that there is one in here that I want to see if I have access to it. Ooh, Stripe, waive transaction fees. That's cool. I would make something like that. Where is the one? So the reason I'm looking for a specific app here, besides the codec stuff, is that there is, codec cake, interview cake. That's cool. I need that for when I find a job. So there's lots of cool resources, like things that I'm like, I've never seen these because there's just so much. Ooh, discounts on hardware. I'm gonna take advantage of that. Sorry. Yes. Okay. So this is what I was looking for. I was looking for working copy. And I actually have this on my iPad, where sometimes I want to pull code before I get on a flight and I want to look over it. Maybe I'm doing a code review. Maybe I want to make comments. Maybe I just want to like code on my iPad really quickly and, push some small commits because I'm like, oh, I know what those edits are. I don't need to Google it. Or I have like, internet access, but my laptop might be too big for the airplane tray. This is really cool, and it was super easy to get installed, and I was so impressed because I was on very long flights, and I'm like, well, wait, maybe I should code on a plane. Realized I need to Google for a lot of that, and I wasn't willing to pay for the price of internet at the time. But the point is, there are so many different resources for anything you could possibly need that you can just pick from and grab, and there's tons and tons of offers. So take advantage of it while you're a student, because how else would you get access to these things except to pay, which requires money? And depending on when you are with things, like you might not have the money to support all of these things. So take advantage, because I sure as heck will for the next 6 months while I'm still a student. Yeah, and so some people are saying, as you can see, the Stripe API is really cool, easy. They have good docs. Awesome. I actually do have a friend who works at Stripe now. She seems to like it. But let's say you are very much interested, you don't have it yet. Go ahead and go to hackpack/GitHub. to go ahead and get the student developer pack. It may take up to a week or two to get authorized, particularly if you have unclear student documentation. So it'll ask you for a picture of your ID, and as long as your ID has an expiration date on it, you should be good to go. If you don't have an expiration date on your student ID, then you may have to submit, which is something I have to do because I don't have an expiration date on my ID. I usually have to submit a screenshot of my semester, what's it called? My semester transcript. To show that I'm an like active student, that I'm paying for credits, whatever. For your if you're a high school, it might be that you need your quarter schedule, semester schedule, however it is that you do it. Lots of different ways. Point is, as long as you showcase that you are the student, this is your course schedule, this is you, you should be good. But you are always welcome to reach out to GitHub. They have a couple different processes to make sure that even if you do happen to fall through the cracks, you can bring yourself back out and get that developer pack set up. Let's see. And I promise you, I am not chilling. I'm just like, there's so many resources. Take advantage of it while you're a student. The only reason I didn't as actively is because I was too busy doing my PhD. And now I'm like, oh, I have 6 months to take advantage of so much stuff. So I'm very excited. We'll see what I end up creating in the next 6 months with that. But yeah, so that's the other reason why I'm like, sign up for GitHub so that way you can get the student developer pack, because there's a ton of resources. That was so much that we just scrolled through. And I didn't even talk about everything. Highly recommend. Also could help you out with your hacks at any hackathon that you go to, online or in person. Or if you feel like you don't want to go to hackathons, but you want to make side projects, that is your place to start. There are so many resources there. And again, they're changing every time. They just added Codex 5 to 6 months ago, and I'm sure they're adding so much more. Every year, there's just new stuff coming. Alrighty. And with that, let's go ahead and get into how do you actually use Git. Now, with GitHub, there's the front end, there's the pretty UI. Once you sign in and make something, let me go back to... Once you sign in and make something, there's lots of different ways that you can interact with GitHub. Again, there's GitHub Actions, there's Copilot, there's just getting access to repositories that are open source, there's libraries, you name it, there are so many resources there. But let's say that you, goodness, let's say that you want to get familiar with Git, you want to use it from the terminal, you can absolutely do that. I highly recommend, because that means you have a little more conscious control of what you want to do. But I always tell people as they're learning Git, with great power comes great responsibility, because you can in fact rewrite time with Git. So, but if you use the front end, just like the GitHub website, you can't rewrite history all that easily. So I encourage people to learn the command line, if only to get familiar with it, know what kinds of commands are out there, so that when they are using tools and other GUIs, that they have a better idea of what's going on behind the scenes. So what even is version control? And it is what it means, you are controlling what version you're using. If you've never used Git before, the example I tend to always use is that if you are working with Google Docs or Word doc, you might hit save and you might, want to see your changes over time. Now, with Google Docs and with Word, those edit histories are cached and you only have a certain amount of times you can hit undo. Google Docs, of course, has the ability to jump back in time where you can restore a previous version, which is much nicer than Word. I think Word does that these days, perhaps. But perhaps you might want a more explicit way of saving those timestamps when you have specific changes, and that's where version control is especially ideal, because that does that for your code. Because currently in your code, you can't exactly hit save and it will have a timestamp. But if you do it manually, which is where version control comes in, you can actually do that. And on top of that, you can also, save pieces of your code, send it to your team. But instead of having to email things or upload to a USB or anything, you are just pushing to some form of repository, a repository referring to Google Drive or Dropbox. And so there's not quite live coding together unless you're on Code Spaces, or there's a lot of different online software to share code live with each other or to pair program with each other. But Google Drive and Dropbox don't quite have that pair coding set up yet, much less Word. So let's say you're not pair programming, but you're working with your team at a hackathon. on some code. You're working on the back end, they're working on the front end, and you're like, oh, I have some stuff set up. Can you test this out? Your stuff isn't ready, but like I'll go push my code, and that way you can use it and test it out really quick with what you have. And so I've used a couple different pieces of terminology that you may not be familiar with, but we'll get into that. But that's the idea of like the working process, is that ideally you're pushing code, pulling code, and being able to have current versions of the code that everyone has collaborated on. And so as punny as I like to be, we're going to master the main concepts, going through commits, branches, and repositories, otherwise known as repos. And so by committing to version control, let's start understanding those commits, where you can view a timestamp of your work in the project. Remember when I said every time you hit Control S or Command S, or every time you hit save, or every time there's an autosave going on. If you're familiar with video games or you like playing them, there's a lot of manual saving involved sometimes, where you have to go through your file or your settings menu and you have to hit save, and then you choose which memory slot, and then you can save where you're currently at in your game, come back to it, and come back later. And depending on how you choose to use your save files or your save slots, you might have different instances, like after this boss I want to save, after this specific world is unlocked I want to save. And so this is another way to visualize commits, where ideally, instead of it doing it for you like a video game where it just says, here's your timestamp, here's the area you were last in or the last level you were at, we would have to write that commit message ourselves. So take that you've edited a file and you're like, this is a new feature. I want to bundle it up and send it off to my repository for everyone else to access. But in order to bundle it, you need to write a message to wrap around what those changes are. So that way future you or other teammates can be like, yes, you just committed feature Y. It does blah, blah, blah. And therefore, I should pull that commit because it's necessary for my work. So making a commit is a little more involved than that, where you want to make changes to your project, such as you've edited a file. And so if you've been watching some of my streams in the last few days, you've watched me create new files, delete files, make functions within a specific file, add CSS and JavaScript and all sorts of other things. But as I make changes, for each feature or for each coding session or however you'd like to scope your work, as long as you are pushing by the end of the day, that's a good start. Some people push frequently and often, and some people push features at a time. There are many different ways in which you can organize your commits, but at the end of the day, try and be descriptive of what those commits are rather than just like every change I've ever made. Bundle it up and say changes. That makes no sense to someone, and it's not very organized. So let's say you make changes to your project, you've added a new feature, and it covers 5 different files that you've touched. You've created 2 of them. To add those changes, you have to say git add and then the file names of the respective changes that you've made. And that's a great way for you to exclude certain changes that you've made that may be related to another feature, maybe some testing stuff, maybe something unrelated. Maybe you're like, oh, we needed to fix this one thing, save it for later. I'll make a separate commit for that. You can do that because you now have control over that. Now, something to consider, though, is that with files, it takes the whole file. So if you made 2 separate changes in a single file, it will be one overall change. But let's say you have 2 features in one file going on and you wanted to commit one but not the other, you'd have to actually remove that code temporarily for your change to go through, because it will only save the current state of the file, and then you'll be like, well, why are these both features in? I wanted to make separate commits. It's because you wrote them in the same file. So this gets into like refactoring and scoping and everything else. But just something to keep in mind, especially if you want to say, well, this has 2 features in it. It's like, well, either separate those files or temporarily delete something or comment it out in such a way that, of course, that you want to separate your commits. So you've said git add file names of whatever consistency or not consistency, of whatever files that you've edited, touched, etc., that are relevant to your feature, your project, whatever, however scoping you're using. And then you need to wrap those up with a commit message by saying git commit -m, referring to the fact that you are adding a message that you are custom writing. If you don't add that -m, you get stuck in Vim. Vim is the most popular question as of a few years ago. It probably still is, where the most popular Stack Overflow question is, how do I exit Vim? Because the amount of people who get stuck there without realizing it is unheard of. So if you're not familiar with terminal, wouldn't hurt to just get familiar with those different editors that are terminal based, such as Vim, Nano, and more. To be fair, I never learned Nano, so I'm always like, how do I exit Nano when I get stuck here? So I get it. But you go ahead and say git commit -m, add some quotations, and put a brief statement of what is going into your commit message. Now, your first commit will oftentimes be initial commit, which is not super descriptive, but if it is all of your initialization work, then that kind of makes sense. But if you're adding a feature, you could say, issue number, blah, 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 feature XYZ. And so there are some keywords that you can use in your commit message to automatically link your commits to specific pull requests, issue numbers, etc., which is very nice. That gets into the more nuanced things of like you want to be very detailed or connect things and show a clear process as you work with things. But sometimes people will be generic in their commit message saying fixed X. Like, great, what did you do to fix it? Like, what was wrong? Or there's just arbitrary messages that don't quite make sense. So think about your future self as you would with when you're commenting your code, and give clear but concise commit messages. You don't want them being too long because that commit message bar that you're using is very short. I try to keep my commit messages under about 10 words, or at least on the terminal line. Like I try to keep it in the same line and cut back a little bit, but I try to be concise enough to know like this is about this. And if I'm having trouble describing things or I'm like being too detailed, it might be because I need to break up my commit. It might be because I have too much superfluous words. All right, let's talk about branches really quick. So if you don't use branches, that's okay because you're already on the main branch. So every time you make a commit, that will be every time you hit Control S, Command S, however you will, and wrap it in a message, you can start to build a timeline of your edits. And now they're labeled by your lovely commit messages, unlike Google Drive where you look through and it's like timestamp, timestamp, timestamp. And you're like, I have no idea what the differences of these are. I don't know why I'm going back in history. I want to find one specific edit, whatever. Commit messages in branches are your timeline. And so as you can see from bottom to top, our oldest commit to our newest commit, where they will just build a stack on top, building our overall main tree. And so you can think of your main branch as the main storyline, the tree trunk, however you'd like to refer to it. There are many different ways, again, like with teaching Git, I've come up with so many different examples for so many different people because everyone learns differently, has different like references to build on their knowledge. So I really try to come up with a lot of different examples, from timelines to story chapters to literal trees to plenty more. But like I said, you are building a timeline of commits from left to right, going oldest to newest, or in this case, we have oldest to newest going bottom to top. There are different ways to visualize it. And so we haven't quite talked about branching beyond just the main branch. We'll get into that as well. But first, you need to understand what a repository is, or a repo. When you start having multiple branches, this is best visualized in your repository to showcase, well, there might be a feature branch or a task branch or an issue branch. All these different type of branches all mean the same thing, is that you deviate from your code, work on a little bit, and then bring it back to your main branch, your tree trunk, your main book, however you'd like to refer to it. And so ideally, branches are a great way to have people work on different things at the same time without impacting the main branch's functionality. Now, this is an idea from agile methodologies where your goal is to always have your main branch have a functioning version of your project. Anyone should be able to download your code and it should just work. The moment that you are only ever on your main branch and you are only ever committing to main, there's a risk of your stuff breaking. And therefore, you might have to go back in time, must have to go do a bunch of stuff, whatever. It depends. Everyone does something completely different. Where some folks will only ever use the main branch because it's just them, which totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It might be that it's a group of people working on the same branch because they are not familiar with branches, they're not comfortable with it, or they don't want to do it that way. And that's okay. Everyone uses Git their own way, and you can too. If you want to take recommendations, personally, I like feature branches, issue branches, bug branches, just to ensure that anytime I am working off the main branch, I have current code, I know that it worked when I left, and that anything I'm doing, if it no longer works, is going to be something that I have done. And when I bring it back together into the main branch, I sure as better hope that it's still working. And so that's where pull requests and testing and a bunch of other stuff comes into play. But there's a chance that someone may have merged something into the main branch while I was still working on my feature, issue, bug, whatever. And so the nice thing is that you can also go ahead and replay the main branch on top of yours to catch yourself up before you even merge back into the main, have to test all those things all together. You can just keep pulling as you go and make sure that you're always up to date regardless. So there's ways with that. Yes. So if you're working with other people, you definitely want to use branches. But not everyone does, and that's okay. There's a lot of different reasons for that. Usually it's inexperience, but it does happen, or it's just such a short project that people are like, it's fine. Just tell me when you push, or I'll just keep pulling before I push, so that way I can have current code and we don't have to deal with too many bugs. But if you're coding a personal project, some people like to just push to main, and some people will like to practice using branches before they're in a collaborative project, so that way they can see, like, they are at fault for anything that happens. Basically, they're like, okay, I've done this branch to make this feature and I've pushed this, but I never merged it, and then I've made this other branch off the main, did that, merged it back in, and now there's conflicts. And they'll naturally, like, basically problem solve their way out of Git things that they've created for themselves, instead of being like, well, what did so and so do, and why is it broken like this, and what happened. You are in complete control. You have every knowledge about what you did and why you probably did it, or you probably didn't know. So it really depends. For me, when I'm doing a personal project, I will start on the main branch, where the more complex my project gets, the more likely I'm going to use a branch. Or I will do a minimum viable product on my main branch. And then when I'm ready to come back and refactor and do all these things, I'll make a new branch, so that way I will always have my working copy. And if things go horribly wrong, I just delete my side branch and everything still works and no one knows what I did. So it very much depends on the person and what their goals are. I would recommend, it is good practice to be using branches even on your personal project, just so you can build that good habit of collaborative coding. But if you're already, like, really familiar with it and you already know what's going on, what to do, whatever, and you're only ever really working on like one, like, computer at a time, it's probably not necessary. I travel so much for MLH and conferences and PhD stuff, and I'm sometimes coding depending on where I'm at, that I could be on my desktop, I could be on my laptop. So because of that, I'm pushing from two different sources, and therefore I'm like, there's a possibility I can make a merge conflict for myself. So branches are good for me in that regard. But when I'm doing things like the streams that I'm doing now for Global Hack Week, I tend to not use a branch because I'm lazy. I tend to push at the end of a stream, or I'll push at the beginning of a stream because I've forgotten or something like that. So all that to say, it depends completely and entirely. All right. And if you're not familiar with what a repo is, repository, consider it your highest level project folder. So this could be where your source folder lives, where your library folders live, especially if you're working with JavaScript, node modules, etc. But if you're working in Python, it might just be your environment folders, and then, your scripts, whatever. There's different file structures, but consider it just your parent folder for the project. Not that you have to have a nested project folder, but like you can have both if you want. And so in this instance, you'll see that there is the source folder with the index HTML and style CSS, but there's also this gitignore file. And so if you're not familiar with gitignore, this is a great way to hide information from any repository that you use, anyone else who's pulling from your repository that you don't necessarily want being pushed to the internet. And so a gitignore is truly what it means, is that Git will ignore file types or file pathways that you've dictated that it should ignore. And so, brief pause to show you gitignore Python. So if you go ahead and just Google a gitignore for a specific language that you're using, you can actually go ahead. There's the GitHub organization that has published a number of different gitignores that you could possibly use. And so as you can see, this is the Python gitignore. I literally just go to raw, hit Control-A, Control-C, like I select everything, copy everything, and then paste it into a brand new gitignore. That should be at your top level folder, a top level file in your top level folder, as you saw in that presentation. And you can see that there's different, different files that it's filtering for. So you can see that any build folders, develop eggs, distribution folders, downloads folders, lib64, etc. Things that you don't necessarily want to put in your repository that would take up space that you don't need, especially causing versioning issue. Instead, you'd have a requirements file for Python. You can see like logs are being ignored, unit tests and coverage reports, settings, all sorts of things. And then if we go to, let's see, there is so there's Java. If you're more familiar with Java, any class files will be ignored, log files, jar, var, etc., tars. There's a couple different things that you'd ignore there. But the point is, depending on what you're using, there are different git ignores out there to automatically filter out some things that you don't necessarily want online. And the one that I'm looking for. So here is if you're familiar with JavaScript, there's the node git ignore, which gets rid of your logs, your debugs, your runtime data. I'm specifically looking for, yes, so your build and release, your node modules, all that's going to be ignored. And so the other thing to consider is your .env files. So your .env files are generally going to be holding your API keys, your special pathways, things that are stored on your local instance that you absolutely do not want pushed to your GitHub, made visible, made public, etc. So be mindful of things that you don't necessarily want on the internet. Your git ignore should filter it. And so if you're not familiar with how to filter, I'd recommend you take a look at these files and see how they work. So as you can see, there's a top level .env, but there's also different types of .env files that they have. This is how they're talking about folders in the current directory. Understanding how directories are written in terminals or command lines is helpful so that way you can write your git ignore in a way that's effective. Because you would hate to accidentally dox yourself with your API keys. You probably paid for your API keys, and you do not want people using those API keys running your rate limit up that you have to pay for. So don't do that. So git ignore, make sure your .env is ignored. Anything else that you don't want in there, ignored. And that should be, again, a top level file in your repository folder. Okay. So let's say you start a project. And to do that, you would go ahead and go to your GitHub, and you would go and on the github.com page, log in, and you would go ahead to the plus sign and say new repository. And you can fill out all sorts of information. Now, GitHub is actually quite nice about how you set up a new repository. You can create a name, although it will always give you some weird batch of names that I'm like, does anyone actually use this? As long as you don't have a repository name in your specific owner, because if you join organizations, there'll be different organizations that own your repository. So make sure you pick the appropriate one. But you can name the repository anything you want within that owner's list. So let's say I had your repo name here already. It would have told me that doesn't exist. It's not available for me to use. I would have to say your repo name here too, or something like that. Descriptions are pretty good to have, even though it says optional. Wouldn't hurt that anyone who glances at your project, especially a resume reviewer, employer, etc., someone who's looking to understand more about your open source work, if you're doing that, a good description really helps make sure either you get the stars, the forks, the clones, whatever it is that you'd like for your project, especially if it's something meant to really help. But a short sentence description doesn't hurt. I think I've done mostly meme things where I'm like, I really want this project because something doesn't exist or whatever. Oh, yes. Thank you. Or years down the line, you want to remember what the repo was. I am a victim of this. I have terrible descriptions. And then because GitHub has, I think in the last few years, made this available, you can choose to make this a public repository, which anyone can see, or a private repository. Now, if you do private, you can make some changes so that way your private commits are still visible on your tree history or whatever it is, even though the repository itself is not. But if you do public, it does mean you can also choose who you can have commits to, who can work with it, etc. But also everyone can see it. So if you leak your secrets, then you will definitely not be happy about that. But if it's private, you can kind of get away with it. Ish. I tend to make everything public these days. The only thing that's really private is like my personal resume, if I have like a LaTeX file, or like my portfolio might be private because I already deploy this to GitHub Pages and that's the public view or something. So there's different ways you can scope that. Doesn't matter how you name the repository. Is there a proper naming convention to handle white space, and what sort of casing is best? It depends. So if you are predominantly, for example, a Python developer, you might use underscores because that's how you approach your variable names. I have to admit, I really don't see underscores or dashes all that often. I tend to use title case for my repository names, but that's because I came from Java, who does camel case. Or I don't know what the other way to refer to it is. It's like leading lowercase, I don't know, something like that. Point is, there are different ways people do things. Some people will use dashes for their spaces. Again, as you can see, I do title case. I just prefer title case, or I will use names that make sense to me. I think Sometimes I'll do lowercase, like if it's a single word, like Adobe, or I'm just picking arbitrary, like names kind of thing. So it really, really depends on what makes sense. I would say from the typing perspective, because I tend to say git clone and then I type out the repository name, that having title case is easier for me than having to go find the dash on my keyboard. Because for some of you who do know, my keyboard is unmarked and it is totally muscle memory of where that dash key is. And if I fumble finger that, that's a sad time. So title case seems to be traditional, and dashes aren't too often with underscores. And then is a portfolio resume better to be public so it can be seen by recruiters and the likes? That's a great question. It depends. You'll find that that's my answer for most things in this stream, specifically. So if it is a portfolio or resume, for example, let's take mine. My portfolio is publicly hosted on GitHub Pages, but you can't see the code that actually made the portfolio happen because I keep that private because there are certain files I just don't want available for people to see in their history. Like I don't want people to see my commit history of, say, like a PDF file for whatever reason. Like maybe I uploaded a PDF that I'm like, oh, that has information I don't want or that I can't share, that I want to remove. And so if I hide that repository, then that Git history is gone. But again, I have a public instance of a GitHub Pages of what I've deployed to my GitHub Pages, and people can still see my portfolio. So the repository might be hidden, but my portfolio is still public, which means they can still see my history of like what I choose to show them. Like my portfolio is full of projects and my like work history, like my LinkedIn, basically. So that is public, and you can absolutely see that, but you can't see what code I've done to make that repository happen. I do know somebody else who does their resume in LaTeX, however you prefer to pronounce it. I think it's LaTeX, where they write their resume there in GitHub, but they don't want to see all the changes and everything. So they have that private, and instead they just generate the PDF, and that's what they host elsewhere. And so that's just a matter of some, privacy conversion or whatever. Because let's say for a PhD student or a grad student in general, we do not use resumes in academia. We use CVs, curriculum vitae. And those have to have a full history of everything we've ever done. That said, for even me, I do not have my resume on, or my like CV on my GitHub. I have it on a separate place that is a LaTeX file where I have every single thing I've ever done. However, I've commented out the things that are relevant to the CV, such as like tiny side projects that I've done that I'm like, no one needs to read my side project in my CV. But I have it there so I know when it happened, what it's about, why I did it, etc., as my like long-term history of my stuff. So if I ever needed to generate a resume, I just copy paste what I have. And I don't have to stress about like, oh, what was that project again? When did I do it? Thus like making interviewing way harder for me. So I construct resumes from that secret copy of my full length history timeline of everything, even though what's actually rendered is a small scale version of certain history that I've allowed to be made public. So yeah. Yeah, so for example, they use GitHub Actions to compile and commit their CV to their website, which is a public repo, but they're private for their CV. All that to say, it depends. Everyone has preferences. Do what makes sense to you and the context that you're working in. So it depends. All right. Those are good questions though. Any other questions about like portfolio, resumes, public versus private? Just want to make sure people are good before we move on. All right, no one said anything, so therefore we shall move on. All right, so you choose public, private, do as you like. Depending on how familiar you are with GitHub or Git in general. If you chose to add a README file, add a git ignore, a license, that might be that you're very familiar with it or you're already just going to upload code to it. I would actually recommend that you not initialize a repository with those steps. even though it says skip this step if you're importing an existing repository. I always recommend that people skip adding these sections. I skip it all the time. And the reason why is, let's see if it will, is GitHub will, when you go ahead and say create repository, if you don't initialize anything, then it will give you the steps to create your repository on your local instance, on your desktop or your laptop or whatever it is that you're using in your internal file structure. It will give you the instructions to commit code. Because otherwise, if you initialize this, let's say you're starting brand new, you haven't written any code yet, then absolutely add the README, add the git ignore, and then clone the repository. Super easy. But if you want to manually set things up because you've already written code and you're like, oh, I forgot to put this on GitHub, let's go do that. Skip those steps, because then GitHub will tell you, hey, this is how you upload code because you already have stuff. If you try to do both, you're going to have merge conflicts, and it's going to be annoying if you're not sure how to deal with it. So I'd recommend choose one or the other. Don't do both until you're ready to deal with merge conflicts, but other way you've made your life miserable. So don't do it. Not that it's a bad thing. It's just like, do you really want to deal with merge conflicts when you're trying to create a new repo? No, don't do it. Okay, so this is somewhat of the guide that they give you. They're going to tell you use the touch command to create a readme.md file. They're going to say git init to initialize Git in that project folder that you're using. So ideally, this is already in a folder that you've created. They say use the README and go ahead and create that. That's good because it will automatically render on your repository. So it's good to have your longer description of like, here's the goals for the project. Here's how to run it. Always have a here's how to run your project. That's just something that I'm thinking about a faculty member that has worked with me for a long time that I'm like, yeah, he always is like, why can't I run this project? I don't know how to run it. Where's the README? Your README should have instructions on how to install, run, test, do whatever you got to do with the program. Because again, future you coming back in 3 years, like, oh, let's go refresh all my projects because these were good ideas but poor execution. And you're like, how did I run this? What commands did I need to run this? And things have changed, so who knows? Then they say git commit -m, first commit, initial commit, however you'd like to refer to it. And then they have git remote add origin. Rather than doing git push -u origin master, do git push -origin or -u origin main. Everybody uses main these days. The slides are a tiny bit out of date. But again, GitHub will show you this. So you don't even need this slide to do things. You can also Google, how do I start a repository locally? If you already had files, let's say you didn't need to do the README because you already had one, you would just git add the README and other files that you have set up that you want to add. And remember, there's no git ignore in this example. So if you already have secrets, make sure you add a git ignore and add that first, just in case, to make sure it filters out the possible addition of your .env files, your node modules, whatever it is you're using that you don't want uploaded to your repository. Great. What makes a good description? Something that future you can come back to and go, what did I do? Or it's something that really sells what your project is doing. Maybe it's like, this library mitigates the issues found in library ABC that does not have blah, 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 blah. Or like whatever it is that your use case is, be very clear. If your project is a joke, then say, this is a joke project that does da, 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 da. Like sticker base is totally just literally, I want to track what stickers I have. I would love to eventually do computer vision on it where I can be like, take a photo, tell me if I have this sticker. If I do, yell at me. Tell me I have more than 20 or something. Because that would be nicer than just being like, let me go search this sticker, blah, 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 whatever. So a good description will just make sure that you know what's going on. All right, so if you have already created a repository by saying, add a git ignore, add a readme, whatever, then you can go ahead and clone it instead of the stuff that we just talked about, where let's say you did not start brand new, fresh, you already had some code, you just want to add it to a GitHub repo. This is the opposite direction, where you would go ahead and click that copy paste button. The screenshot is a little bit older, or you can go ahead and directly in your terminal or command line run git clone, whatever the URL is. So it'd be github.com/your username/your repo name.git. And that's how you can actually clone stuff. Now, if it's private and you're not logged into your Git instance or your GitHub through your desktop through terminal or your laptop through terminal, it's going to tell you it can't find it. It's going to tell you don't have the permissions. So make sure everything is set up that you can access what you need to access. All right. So we talked about singularity of sorts, where you've been working with folks, you've been, or you're working on your own projects, you're setting it all up yourself. What about when you're working with other people? And this is where the terminology I've been mentioning so far about pushing and pulling comes into play. I should clarify, though, you don't have to work with people to use this terminology, because chances are if you're working with yourself, you're still pushing and pulling stuff. Well, you're mostly pushing stuff. You're not quite pulling, but you should try pulling elsewhere. So as far as how we share code, we specifically will work locally. So we've worked on Visual Studio Code and we're writing our code. We've hit save, and that stuff is saved locally to whatever file structure it is that we're using. So ideally our local repository, local folder, everything that is on your hard drive in your laptop, your desktop, whatever it is you use. But when you're ready to push your code up to GitHub, and this is the way that people tend to visualize it, is that you are working on your laptop, your desktop, whatever. So you're pulling stuff down from cloud, from GitHub, but you are pushing stuff up to the cloud or up to a repository, up to something that is online, so that way you can access that. So when you are making changes on your laptop or desktop, you will eventually hit save and then go, I want to write a commit message, and you will push your changes to GitHub so the rest of your team can go ahead and access it. Or if you happen to work on multiple devices, you would then be able to go pull the stuff from the GitHub online cloud, whatever you prefer to refer to it. You'll be able to pull it down to your other device. So creates this nice little cycle where everybody makes sure that their timelines are synced, hopefully. Please. As often as you commit, you should also be pulling. In fact, you should pull regularly, far more than you probably push, unless you're pushing every single little file change, in which case I'm concerned about you. That's a little too much. But if you are pulling regularly, you'll reduce the risks of merge conflicts or reduce the risks of running into things where you're like, oh, I haven't implemented that, the way to handle this yet. Or, oh, I didn't realize you were working on this file. So you should have told me you were going to have to work on this file because now I have changes that you've overwritten, etc. Communication is key here. The other thing is that by pulling often, you don't have to wait for someone to tell you, hey, I pushed a thing. You should just assume you should be pulling often. And this is something I've run into tangentially, where some people feel that they should be told that when they should go pull code, and no, that's not the case. You should pull often, just as you should push often, so everyone's up to date with the different changes going on, so long as it's not breaking things. If it's breaking things, then they're probably committing to main, and life is a little bit harder. A lot harder. Anyway, so we've talked a lot about it conceptually. The goal of Git and GitHub and Bitbucket and whatever you use is that you don't have to send anyone a zipped up project. You don't have to give anyone a flash drive. You don't have to keep dragging code all over the place. You just have to say git add commit -m, blah, 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 blah. Hit git push. And when you say git push, your GitHub repo will be updated. So for example, in this image, we have on the far left where you have made changes on your laptop, on your desktop, and you're like, I want my friends to have access to this, or I'm about to go go work at a coffee shop, and I've been working on my desktop, so I'm going to go to my laptop. So I need to make sure that I have a copy of what I've done because I want to continue not from scratch. And so currently your GitHub repo will not have what you've worked on because you haven't said, hey, I've pushed code. By saying git push, you're telling GitHub repo, your online instance, to be like, yes, there are changes. I must note them in my timeline, because otherwise the timelines don't match up. Once you say git push, and if it's successful, then the timelines are matched and updated. And now you'd be able to go run off to your coffee shop with your laptop and be able to pull down your updated code. Because now you're going to say, hey, GitHub repo, send me the updates. And that's how you pull or download your changes. And yes, that is bad. Don't send code in email. This has been a public service announcement. Don't email code. Just don't. All right. So let's say you are on your laptop. You are realizing your code is out of date. Someone has made changes. You've made changes. Past you did something, and you're like, oh, I need that. So the way this will look on the other side of things is that your GitHub repo is now updated from our push, but your local repo on your laptop is out of date because it doesn't have the 2 commits that you've created. So by saying git pull, that's how, again, you download the changes, merge it all in, etc. And if you need to know more about how git pull works, it is a combination of git fetch and git merge, where git fetch will actually go ahead and check, hey, are there any changes that you should be worried about? And you can actually write this instead of git pull if you want to check. If you don't git pull, you will not get those changes. If you just say git fetch all the time, your cached history will be like, yeah, here's all these things that happen. But your local instance will not reflect those changes because you have not said, also go ahead and merge that into mine. So git fetch won't change your code, but all the ponies will be aware of all the updates in your repository, and you need to say, well, we need to actually incorporate those changes in. All right, so now the terminology behind how you push things. You need to stage your changes, which is where you're adding your files. Don't use dot or asterisk. Just don't. The reason I'm advising against this is more from a quality of commit perspective, and also to avoid you just being like, yeah, git add everything. It's just easier that way. I have to type less. Like, cool. I love that reasoning. It's garbage reasoning. And the reason why is because what if you add something that you really don't want to add, like your API secrets or any information or downloads or things that you're like, oh, this was sample data. Don't do that. And you'll find that I did that in Stickerbase, where I was like, oh, the uploads folder with that image got uploaded to GitHub, and I didn't want that, and now it's in my history. Always manually add what files or folders you want uploaded in your changes. Don't use git add dot or star. Just don't. So stage your changes. And then if you would like to check, which someone's getting ahead of me, but use git status to verify that you've actually added things that you've used. Read through the git status, because I sure didn't. But by using git status, it'll tell you what's ready to be added, what has been added, and maybe anything that might have been an error. And so you have to manually add some other things. So you've checked your status, you've made sure that you're good. This is in fact what you want to bundle into your commit message. So you'll go ahead and write git commit -m, whatever message about your code that is going to be descriptive but concise about what have you done. And then you would write git push. So I talked about what happens if you don't use a -m. This will open a Vim editor. In order to exit Vim, escape, WQ, enter. If you don't want to save because you have not made any changes, escape, Q, enter. Done. So you can manually use Vim. I like the idea of learning Vim. Nobody else does, so don't. Just quit. And then rewrite your commit message, because it's going to be like, oh, no, I didn't want that. If you write and quit, though, it will write that commit message. So just use quit. And then git push. So again, git add, git commit, git status will probably be blank at that point. Oh, it absolutely is annoying. But if you add things that you don't want to add, that's even worse, because now you need to go rewrite history. So if you don't want to rewrite history, don't use git add dot. And I'm being harsh about this mostly because I'm like, the amount of times people have pushed awful things or things that they shouldn't upload or things that they have gotten themselves like, oh no, my API key is out in the wild. Oh no, like, permissions or things that should not be public have been made public, is because somebody probably used git add dot or git add star. And that's why. So it's annoying, but it means you have complete control of what's going on instead of putting in everything and going, oops, I uploaded the wrong thing. Because it's really annoying to have to go regenerate an API key. And if you do it at a production level, good luck. All right. So this is more about what you'll see in command line. This is me actually going through and creating that repository where I've cloned the repository. I've checked the latest status where it says, hey, you're up to date with origin/main. But then it says you actually have a modified file called README. So in order to, because it's in red, then I would know, oh, well, that means it's out of date and it's not actually updated on my Git repository up in my that instance. And then go ahead and add, push, and then it will tell you, okay, it's done the push, things are updated, you're good to go, and move on. Yes. But what happens if you naively copy a git ignore and then assume everything is fine? Again, a very valid example is I forgot to edit my git ignore with the /uploads directory that I didn't want to include in my upload or in my git push. So people make mistakes, evidenced by the fact that I did that in the last few streams. So try to be mindful that this is another way of catching those mistakes before they happen. Instead of being lazy about it, you can actually make sure that you have clean code, that it's concise, that people can see your history, and it's not full of like stupid mistakes. So food for thought. Professionally, it's not a bad idea. On your side projects, who cares? But practice makes perfect, and quality matters in industry. It's not just push, like make fast, break fast. It's not always like that. Yes, you can just use git push and it will push you to the current branch. Because if you always push to main, then you're always pushing to main. But the moment you start using branches, you don't want to push to main. You want to push to your branch. So as long as you're checked out on the branch that you want to use, we'll get into that later, it will push to that branch. Okay. So you are working with yourself and you're a moron. Me, I'm the moron. Or you're working with other people on your team who don't know how to use Git, or there's something that happened that you're like, oh, there's a conflict. Normally, Git merge will do it for you. It will recognize, hey, there's some differences and it's okay, and it won't actually address anything without being an issue. It will merge things and it'll be fine. But sometimes Git needs a little help, and that's where humans step in to have to do things. And so there's merge conflicts that occur when you are overwriting newer code, either when you're pushing or you're pulling. So let's say you and your teammate are working on the same file. They push first and you're about to go push your work, but because it's in the same file, potentially in the same lines of code or the same code line, now you're having a merge conflict because GitHub doesn't know which one to keep, especially if you're both working at the quote unquote same time, rather than just, oh, they've committed, I've pulled the code in, now I go write my stuff. Then it's fine. But if you both happen to push at the same time or in similar times where one of you has not retained the history of the other, then you start having issues, especially if you've made your commit and they've made their commit, and now you have these two separating commits that now need to be merged back into main, where main's like, which one do I choose? But they're both in the timeline, in the commit dots. One of these needs to come first, and I don't know which one. So whenever that happens, that's when you have to step in and fix it yourself. And there are different ways to handle it. Visually, you'll get some kind of rewrite of your code in the specific areas that it's saying, hey, here's the changes. Or there are tools and various GUIs that will show you this using some form of highlighting, coloring, etc., to help you look at conflicts and see which one is the incoming change and which one is the originating change and which one do you want to keep. Sometimes you need to merge both because you both were doing something completely different. So there's different ways you can get around it, such as you could stash your changes and then go ahead and pull, or you can reset your stuff to a previous version and then go pull the stuff and then play your stuff on top. And I'm being very abstract about this, but there are different commands involved in this process of where you're basically saying, in the timeline, I want to write this and then this and then this, and then we're good. Because Git can't do it for you, you have to tell Git what to do. Sometimes Git is a very advanced 2-year-old that you're like, I need you to do this, 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 this. Great, do it. So be careful and be mindful of the commands that you're using, particularly with reset, where you might wipe your changes. So being smart about how you use things, because again, with great power comes great responsibility. You have the chance of wiping your history. You have the chance of wiping your changes. You have the chance of making more of a mess. So being careful with how you step through these changes and handling merge conflicts, whether it's that you use a GUI or that you know what you're doing in code that helps you deal with things, better. And so in this case, the head is the current change. So whoever is the one dealing with the issue. So let's say you're the one who is merging your friend's changes into your stuff. You have the new change that you wanted to merge in, but your friend already pushed things. So the incoming change is generally going to be your friend's stuff, I believe. But it like swaps over depending on who's doing what and when. So use a GUI if it's confusing. If it's not confusing and you know which code you need to keep, then just do it in code. If you decide that you don't quite like command line or that you want to use a GUI to help you out, even though you understand what's going on in the back end, consider using Git Bash, Git Kraken, Git GUI, Desktop for GitHub, TortoiseGit, SmartGit, SourceTree. There are so many things out there. If one tool doesn't work for you, find a tool that does. And if none of these work for you, then I think you're stuck in command line, but there's nothing wrong with that. I think you have more power over what's going on with Git if you use command line. You do have the higher likelihood of making mistakes, but it's also easier to undo those mistakes. Whereas if a GUI makes a mistake, you have no idea what they did if you don't understand what's going on in the background. Yeah. So for example, GitHub has a great GUI for it. Click the top of your repo, get the number of commits, show your commit history, show the merge conflict, voila. Diffs are great. Okay, and then if you'd like to learn more, you can go to githowto.com. There's the documentation on git-scm. You can also search Google and say, how do I do a git whatever? Or how do I fix this error? Or what do I do when git something? However, do not just use Stack Overflow and then copy paste like you would your code, or use ChatGPT where it says, oh, run this thing, and just paste it without thinking about it. Great power, great responsibility. If you just willy-nilly put stuff, you will cause irreparable issues. Or it might work, and you have no idea. It's a 50-50. So try to understand what commands you're running before you run them, especially in a command line, just because sometimes things happen. And it's better to be conscious and aware of like, I'm going to use this git command. I'm pretty sure this is what I mean. Therefore, let's do it. And if not, here's how I undo it. Just to make sure you don't rewrite your whole history and blow up the repository or something. Okay, so we've done the presentation. We got through just about everything. But what else is there? So we've talked about cloning. We've talked about branches. We've talked about pushing, pulling, and we've kind of touched on status. But we didn't have things about git config, git log. We didn't have anything on git checkout. And we also didn't talk about any of these. We talked about forking. And we talked about, we didn't talk about fork. We talked about fetch. We didn't talk about heads. We talked about these two. We didn't talk about git reset. And we didn't talk about any of these hard things. So these are things that are going to come up more as you interact with GitHub and Git technically. As you start doing more than just, well, if I want to branch, if I want to do things, if I want to move beyond the basics, what else is there? So let's actually do some of that stuff. So I'm not going to go ahead and create a new repository, but I am going to use a git init so we can actually do some of the other commands in terminal, in command line. Okay. So this is the code that I have from yesterday where we were doing some Postgres Python work. And I'm going to go ahead and open a git bash terminal because I use git bash just because it makes my life easier. And so I'm going to run a git status, and it's going to yell at me because right now we are not a git repository, which means we have not initialized git. So we go ahead and we say git init, and voila, now we have a .git folder, which is not going to be visible in our folder structure here because it's a hidden file because of that .git in my stuff. But let me show you what it looks like. So if I do list git, it's going to give me information like configuration and description and heads and whatnot. Don't touch those. Just know it's there. It does the magic behind the scenes to turn our folder, our project folder, into a project repository. And so now that I've done a git init, now we can run git status. And now it's going to tell me, hey, your db.py is a file that hasn't been tracked yet. Your git environment is something that hasn't been tracked yet. And your data family relations is not tracked yet. So nothing has been added to commit, which means all these files are read. I could track them if I wanted to. what I really want to do is add a git ignore because I don't want to push this environment folder because nobody needs my environment folder. They can just make their own. And so I would probably have to add a git ignore. And so this is usually the easiest way. I go ahead and create a file. I type touch.gitignore, and it's going to go ahead and create a file that I now have visibility on. And so voila. And so the way to go ahead and get rid of a folder is that I would probably just type .env. And so before I add any of my other stuff, I'm going to add the git ignore. So I would add git ignore. Now let's run git status again. And so environment is still showing up, probably because I didn't quite do that correctly. And so now that I've made a change to our git ignore file, you can see it's yellow in Visual Studio Code. But if we open this up again, now we have a separation. So we have a tracked file git ignore, and we have our DB and family relations. But now environment no longer shows up on our list for status because we have ignored it through this git ignore file. So now it says that git ignore has been modified. So let's go ahead and add that back in where we say git add.gitignore. And now we should have a green file, which is a new git ignore file. And we have the two files that we want to add it and make sure that we add those if we want to. Maybe we don't want to add any of our data files for whatever reason. Now we can add these two files. So we're not going to do that yet. I'm not going to write a commit message. I'm running out of water, but I want to follow up with what we have. So let's see. We haven't done checkout. We haven't done branch. Haven't done log or config. We've done status a bunch. Fork hasn't been done. Previous head, reset, and all that. Okay. So let's take a look at git log. And if I type in git log, then it's going to say our current branch main does not have any commits yet. So once I make my first commit, then I would be able to see some of the changes I've done. But there's also a secondary log called git ref log, which will show all of the things I've changed. But right now, again, it's saying I don't have any commits yet. So git ref log is something that you would use after your initial commit, where if you've rebased, if you've made any configuration change, any change you've done through GitHub, through Git specifically, git ref log will show you that. Git log will only show you a history of your commits. Git ref log will show you that and so much more. So if you have made any mistakes and you want to go back in time and undo things, but you don't remember the commands you've used, git ref log will actually help you out quite a bit. Now, if you've completely wiped history, there's a chance you're not going to get that back either. So we're going to go ahead and say git commit, initial commit. I didn't spell that right. Initial commit. Okay, so now it says things have changed. And we're going to do a git log, where now it tells me information about who I am, what my message was, and it also gives me this hash code, where it says I'm going from my head of my timeline or my commit history to the main branch. Now, this hash is something I might use if I wanted to jump back in time. Let's say I've made more commits and I realized those commits were not it. We should not be there. What I can do is I can jump back using git reset head a couple different times, and I can jump back to this in time if I wanted to. But now that we have this existing, whatever. Okay, so we talked about that. Let's say I want to do git branch. I think yes. So if I type git branch, it will give me a list of all the branches I've created. Now, currently, I only have the first one. But let's say I wanted to create a new branch and move over to it. And this is something I use a lot, which is git checkout -b. And I might say second branch. And so it says I've switched to a new branch, second branch, which you can now see here. It says this. And if I were to write git branch again, now it shows me, hey, there's the main and the second branch, but the asterisk tells me which one I'm currently on. Now let's do a git status. All of my changes carried over. But because of, again, so this is not a but actually, this is an and. Because I moved over from the branch, I now have this commit. So let's go ahead and do a quick status. Git add db.py, git commit, branch example. Close that. Okay, So let's do a git log here in this branch. I now have two separate commits. Again, two new hashes. One commit was done on the main branch and one commit has been done on the second branch. Okay, so you'll saw that there was a colon. I just hit Q so I could exit my list of logs. The more commits you have, the more you can scroll through them, and the way to exit them is to hit Q. Now, let's say I check out the main branch, no dash B because I'm not creating something, and I did another git log. I still only have that first commit. It does not have access to the commit that I made on the second branch. Now I can flip-flop back and forth, especially if I have features that I'm making. Let's say I had two features I was working on at the same time. I might use this third branch that is that feature, a second branch, which is my first feature, and the main as the always functioning project or product instance that I have. Eventually, I would merge either of those branches, whichever one's finished first, into main, and then on the other branch, I would merge main into them to catch them up, or I would rebase to play the commits on top of each other. Okay, we've done those two. We've done log. Config is something that you'll need to set up when you first have your Git. And so you can actually create local and global configurations where maybe for the specific folder that I'm in, I want to use a specific email and author name. When you start entering different organizations, for example, I'm part of a nonprofit, I'm part of a conference organizing group, so I have different ownerships and I would want to commit under different usernames and emails and whatever. And so what I could do is that my global configuration is what I have, but if I'm entering a repository where I'm like, oh, we need to use a very specific commit history or authorship, then I would go through and I would say git config my author name, git config my email, and that's a quick Google where I might be like git config email. And it will tell me git config -- global user.email. But if I wanted to do a local instance, I would just drop the global. So Git prioritizes configurations at the local level over the global level and global over system. So if it's configured at the same time, then it's always going to take the most specific level as precedence. So let's really quick just confirm. If I want to config locally, then I would have to go ahead and say just git config user.email or git config user.name, such that I would have to be clear about who's committing what, which again, when we pull up git log, will show us that authorship history. Okay. All right. Previous head. Let's go do that. So we're going to go ahead and check out back to our second branch. And again, when we git log, we have two commits that we're working with, where we have the instance where we added the git ignore, and we have the instance where we added db.py. But I realized I don't really want to do that. Come on. You know, let me out. I'm typing Q. Well, let's go open a new git bash. Okay, I don't know why it broke, but whatever. Okay, we're on the right branch. It says it also here. We do a git log, saving us those two. Okay, now we want to say git reset head. I think it's, oopsie daisy. I think it's 1. I also want to say, I could be wrong in that. Okay, JK, I did it right. All right. So I typed in git reset hard to 1 instance of head. If I wanted to do 2, I would be back to before this. So if I had multiple commits, maybe I could go back 1, 2, 3, however many it is that I would like to go back. Now, let's quickly check git status. Nothing has changed family relations wise because we were never tracking that. So far, so good. Let's say we git add family relation. Actually, wait. Can we cherry pick that back? Nah, I don't care enough. Let's git checkout main, and then I was going to, yes, we did a reset. Let's say git add family relations, and I haven't committed yet, but maybe I want to say git reset. And so let me show you more clearly what's going on. What I did was I added something. I added the family relations, and now it was tracked. But because I said git reset, I said just wipe it all. We want to reset. where we don't want to add these files. So if I make a mistake or I don't want to add something, then I would use git reset. And I think you might be able to specify specific files, especially if you're like, I actually want to unstage something. And so it's also saying git restore -- staged, whatever the file is that we want to unstage. So we can also do that. So let's go ahead and git restore -- staged, family relations. Did not match anything. Oh boy. What do you mean? Okay, well, we're going to just do git reset. And that way we can manually do it. I don't know why it didn't work, but I don't use that anyway, so more power to me, I guess. But now there are different ways we can say, oh, we goofed. We added too much. Let's go remove that really quick. So very easy to finagle things before we hit commit. Once we've committed, we can still go back in time, but once we've pushed, rewriting history gets a lot harder. So if you're going to do any rewriting of history, make sure that you're clear about that before you actually push to your GitHub repo. Make edits on your commits. You might also consider rebasing, where rebasing will play back history with specific options that you have. I already went through headless branches last Git stuff, but headless branches are something that you enter when you're cherry picking things or you want to open a specific commit. So let's say I wanted to merge something in, cherry pick something in, or I wanted to open a specific branch, make some changes, see how that goes, and maybe I don't need it anymore, or maybe I eventually want to reconnect it back. So whenever let's see, git log. Let's say I wanted to open a branch on this specific commit, which I can. So I would say git checkout. I think it's git checkout specific commit. Yes, I want to take the hash value. And so I would say git checkout this commit. And so now it says you are in a detached head state. You can look around, make experimental changes, commit them, discard commits, etc., without impacting any branches by switching back to a branch. If you want to create a new branch to retain the things that you commit, you need to say git switch.c or otherwise undo it. This is advice you should keep on because it will tell you, are you in a headless branch, which you can also see when you look at this commit hash here. If you don't want it, delete it, move on, etc. But if you want to just say, oh, make a pull request with this detached head branch, you can't. It's gross because it's like you have your tree, you've ripped off a branch and said, here's my new branch, instead of actually maintaining the connection. And until you actively say, let's go reconnect it, you can say merge. And it's going to be like, well, where is the history to say that we can merge things? So be mindful if you ever find, oh, there's a bug in my commit. Oh, I want to rebase the specific commit with specific cherry-picked commits on top and merge that back in. You need to use git switch -c with whatever the branch name it is that you're going to use. Otherwise, you're merging something without history back into something that has history, and it's going to be like, Git's going to freak out on you because it won't know what's going on. Git will say, why are you trying to merge new history? And I have no idea where this history is. Who is this? It's like you're letting a stranger into your home and Git's like, I don't know what to do with this because it doesn't have the history to match up anything. So, word of warning, be mindful when you're doing that. Let's go ahead and git checkout main. And if we do git branch, it's not there. So you can't even switch to it accidentally unless you manually switch to that commit. Okay, ranting over. We did that. We did that. We did that. We've talked about rebasing and cherry picking. Maybe there's like a graphic somewhere. Git rebase graphic. I just want a GIF. Show me a GIF. Okay. I have found one. Okay. So if you've never set up your terminal, by the way, this is something you're going to have to experience where it's going to tell you, hey, how do you want to do your Git merges? Do you want to do a fast forward merge? Do you want to do a rebase merge? I would recommend a rebase. I think there's another one where it's like this squash merge or something else. I don't remember, but there's 3 options and I usually choose rebase. So rebase, let me zoom in, is where it will play things in order, but it'll recreate your work onto the branch into another. And so you'll have to get new commits with the same changes. I prefer this over fast forwarding because what if things are not chronologically, like I can either chronologically build it back up or I can just let it properly like rebuild on top. And I would personally not prefer chronological because if there's multiple people working on things, then chronological is disgusting because now you have person 1's edit, person 2's edit, person 3's edit, and you have to figure out how to cross merge all of those people's stuff that maybe affects the same function every single time. You have to keep playing each of your commits all the way to this top to figure out, well, who is the right commit? Versus rebase is like, here's a chunk, here's a chunk, here's a chunk. And you only have to edit those things. A little easier, in my opinion. So it is a way to replay commits one by one on top of a branch, and it just gets rid of that chronological mishap, especially if you're all working on something at the same time, which is disgusting to merge. Just easier. So yeah, as you can see, they are playing it on top, nice cute little graphic. Here's the fast forward graphic in case that's not making all that much sense. Ideally, it'll just shift everything over, but again, what if there's multiple people working on things at the same time? Could suck. Yeah, so you'll lose some content, some context, etc. The cons of this one is that you're going to squash things, could be rebasing, could be a little more rough, but I find that I use this more often in working environments, so it is good to know what happens with rebase because the amount of times I've had to do rebases at work because I couldn't do fast forwards really sucked. So good to know both. Choose the one that works best for you. Rebasing is just good to know. And we are pretty much at the 30 mark. I want to pause and ask if there's any questions, comments, concerns. We did actually do reflog. I talked about that. Wait, maybe I can do it now. Yeah, okay. So now we have all the history of the things that we've done with Git reflog. Where we had when I checked it out, when I reset stuff, when I checked out, when I reset stuff, all sorts of history, starting from that initial commit. So even though I made edits to the head, reflog tells me everything I did. So this is really good if you need to undo something that you've done by accident. Would not hurt. Just a thought. To use reflog as your reference. And then patches are, I still haven't had a chance to go Google this. I know somebody else who does like work on their own GitHub ends up doing a lot of patches, which I was like, I don't understand why, because I've actually never done a patch except to help with rewriting history and ensuring it was done by the correct author. But I would call it Git debugging and patching is what I would say. But yeah, again, we have a little over 30 minutes. So if there's questions, comments, concerns, things that we didn't go over, things that weren't clear, please let me know so we can go over them. No questions. I find this very hard to believe. We talked about a lot of different stuff. Oh, we didn't talk about forks. My bad. Forks is a variation of cloning where you want, so I think most people would probably fork my sticker base or other projects that other people have done if they've posted on GitHub, so that way they can make their own changes to it. And maybe if you're working on like an open source thing, you might want to pull request your version back in. It's basically like cloning is just like you would be able to commit changes back to the original repository versus forking, you would be able to commit changes to your working repository. So if a repository is locked for editing, for example, because you're not an authorized committer, editor, whatever, then you would want to make sure that you fork the repo so you can make changes, because you would have permissions on your own repository copy of it. And then you can make like pull requests to say like, well, I want to add my changes in because it fixed this bug that you haven't addressed yet, for example. In which case they would say yay or nay, approve, disapprove, make comments, discuss, whatever, and go from there. How to do patches. Let's go Google that. Why do you git patch? Okay, why should we git patch? Patches are often used to share changes between repositories without committing or pushing changes directly to a remote repository. And the difference between a patch and a commit is a patch is a file containing the set differences between the versions of file, versus commit is going to just override specific things. Okay, so as for how to do it, let's see if, will you do it? Yes, git create patch in the command line. Okay, so you would use git log in the terminal to get the commit SHA. So if that was maybe not on your GitHub repo, which I don't have it up right now, but there's a way you can preview the SHA. And you don't actually need the full line. I think you need like the first 6 or something like that. But if they give you the full line, just take the full line. And so, as you can see, they're using git format patch with the commit SHA and then where you want it saved to. So whatever the changes are associated with. And this is going to be from a single commit, but it seems like you can also create it from a branch. So let's say you made a feature branch that you didn't want history for, would be my understanding at least, that you could make a commit or a patch from all of those commits, and then it would be put on top. So again, the way that I ended up using it is that we actually did it from, like we pulled a branch and then certain patches were separated out based on who committed what. Which I'm not quite sure how to do, but the way that I ended up using it was I had a project with someone who rewrote our file history, which was wrong. So we had to go back into the log, pull those commits out, figure out what commits were by who, create the patch files themselves, which had the differences, and then each person individually who was the author had to commit that patch. So we had 5 people working on the thing. So 5 people had to commit in a specific order to upload the changes that we had made. And so the way that we did that was we checked out the associated commit or branch that we wanted it applied to, and then we just applied the git patch file. And then presuming all was good, then we moved on to the next person and ran another git patch. But again, as you can see, there's like git tortoise, git kraken, who will let you do your own version of git patch, which I cannot explain. But at least through a command line, I can kind of explain that like you have to format the patch from whatever it is you're planning on getting those changes from, and from whatever the commit message is, or from the branch. And then you need to actually apply those by checking out the associated branch, because you never want to apply it on your main. Just don't, because then you have to rewrite history on main, whereas you can just delete a branch and then no history ever existed and it's fine. And then apply that patch. So as you can see, you can now apply it to your local repository. You can move on with your workflow knowing it's all up to date. You can keep making commits, keep making changes, and you're good to go. And yes, when you're pair programming or working with other people, is it advised to fork the repo? It depends on where the repo is coming from. If you are working together on a team, these people who are working with you probably all have edit access to the repository. So you don't need to fork it, you just need to clone it as long as you have direct editing access. If you are working on an open source project or a library, or you're like, oh, I really like your project, sticker base, it's great. I don't have edit permission, so I would fork the repository, make my changes, make my edits, and you might realize, oh, hey, there's a massive bug in your authentication thing. I've gone ahead and patched it up, make the commit, create the new branch, make a pull request, going back to the original repository and say, hey, I saw you had a horrible different bug that would terrible, everything would be awful. Here's a pull request to fix that so that we don't have to deal with it. It's a security issue. And so I would only advise forking if you do not have edit access. Let's say that the repository is locked. This happens in industry where there might be a team organization, which has a ton of GitHub repos, where you want to work on some specific repository, but only people who are production level managers will have edit access to it. So you'll need to fork that repository, make your changes, make your edits, do a pull request back to that repository. It will undergo automations, CI/CD, what's it called? Pull request reviews, all that kind of stuff. Make sure the code is good to go, and then you're good. So this is a slight variation on the, only ever pull request into the main branch, make sure main branch is protected. This is a secondary level of security, where as long as you fork the repo, anything you mess up will never affect the main repository because you simply don't have edit permission. And the only way you might have access is by pull requesting back into that repository. So short version, working with your friends, no, don't fork, just clone. Make sure you all have edit access. If you are doing something open source, nonprofit, library, you want to commit during October, whatever, it's not your repository and you don't have access, fork the repository. Cool. We have done just about everything. Awesome. With good timing, because my cat wishes to be let out. So with that, I think we will pretty much wrap up. Any last questions? Now is your time, but otherwise, enjoy the rest of your Global Hack Week. We have a light day today, so definitely work on all of your challenges, especially because they'll be due a little after tomorrow, so not to put some time pressure on you, but make sure you're done. I do know that there is an upcoming stream. Let me go find that. Later this evening / morning for folks, where at 3 p.m. Eastern, which JK, my schedule shows it in GMT, so it's actually coming right after this. Yes, so in 30 minutes, Jocelyn will be doing a quick data viz project for hackathon projects, good for presenting your data clearly and impressively during hackathons. And then much, much later today, she'll be doing a mini event. So go ahead and take a break, get some water, go to the bathroom, grab snacks, all that stuff, so you can be ready to go for Jocelyn's work. I'm actually not sure. I'm only able to see from the description that we've been given. So I'd say tune in for the first, 5-10 minutes, see it if you like it. But I'd say, show up anyway because it's the last one for a couple hours. Show her some MLH community love. I'd say it's probably going to be something about, if it's data visualization, it could be matplotlib. It could be, what's it called? Strapi, something. There's a couple different libraries I'm thinking of for data visualization that it could be any one of those. So I'd say check it out. And there's lots of Node.js diagramming libraries too. So I'd say take a look, see if it fits with your expertises. If not, just have it on the background and show her some love, because I think it would be a nice encouragement. Especially because toward the end of the week, y'all get really focused on your challenges and tend to not show up, and it's very quiet. So wouldn't hurt to at least, show her some MLH community love. Well, again, it's so the reason I'm saying this is because toward the end of the week, people are very tired, or they're like, oh, I'm so focused on my challenges. And so the coaches who are usually doing it at the end don't get as much of the love that they do at the beginning of the week. So it's kind of imbalanced. I get why, but it would be a good way to end the week strong, especially because Jocelyn is one of our newer coaches. I think this is her first or second Global Hack Week. So go ahead and spend some time with her. But also, again, it's in 20 minutes. So take now to take your break so you can be refreshed and give her your best in that time frame. Awesome. Well, for those of you who are going to bed, because I know it's quite late on the other side of the world, go get some rest. And if not, stay tuned for Jocelyn's stream shortly. Have a good one, and see you tomorrow for Today in Global Hack Week with another new coach, Quinn. In case you'd like to make sure that, yeah, she is the one who did the MongoDB one. So I'm sure it'll be great. Cool. Bye, y'all.